Welcome to Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our website is libertylawtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links relevant to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@libertylawtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today we are talking with R.J. Pestritto of Hillsdale College about the American Progressives. Ronald Pestritto is the Charles and Lucia Shipley Chair in the American Constitution, and he is the Dean of the Graduate School of Statesmanship at Hillsdale College. He is the author of Woodrow Wilson and the Roots of Modern Liberalism, and he is the editor of 2 books on progressivism, Woodrow Wilson, The Essential Political Writings, and along with William Atto, American Progressivism. Professor Pestritto is also, among other books, the editor of Challenges to the American Founding, Slavery, Historicism, and Progressivism in the 19th Century. RJ, welcome to Liberty Law Talk.
Thanks, Richard. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you. I wanted to begin by reading a selection from Woodrow Wilson. This is actually his campaign speech he gave in the 1912 presidential campaign. And after that, I kind of want to get your reaction to it because I think it does kind of crystallize his political science. As he explained, the makers of our federal Constitution read Montesquieu with true scientific enthusiasm. They were scientists in their way, the best way of their age. Those fathers of the nation, they constructed a government as they would have constructed an orrery to display the laws of nature. Politics in their thought was a variety of mechanics. The Constitution was founded on the law of gravitation. The government was to exist and move by virtue of the efficacy of checks and balances. The trouble with the theory is that government is not a machine, but a living thing. It falls not under the theory of the universe, but under the theory of organic life. It is accountable to Darwin, not to Newton. It is modified by its environment, necessitated by its tasks, shaped to its functions by the sheer pressure of life. No living thing can have its organs offset against each other, has checks, and live. So thinking about this quote, what is the progress that progressives like Wilson seek after, and how do they know they're progressing? By what would they measure progress?
Well, your second question there is that's a tough one. So I'm going to take the first. I'm going to take the first part of it first, and I should point out, by the way, that little sort of vignette there at the end of Wilson's quote, where he says, no living thing can have its organs offset against each other as checks and live. It sounds great, and I've been teaching that for years. And I finally paused at one point. I think it was in class. And it occurred to me, it's actually not correct to say that. I mean, if you think of human physiology, we have all kinds of parts of our bodies, systems within our bodies that check one another. We have an immune system and the like. And so actually, it's a nice sounding little little finish to the quote, but actually it doesn't quite follow if you think about it. It's sort of something I've been teaching for years, and I finally sort of paused at it. But with respect to the sort of broader meaning of what Wilson's getting at there, I mean, there's a lot going on in that quote, and we know that it builds up in that speech in 1912 to a criticism of the separation of power system. And Wilson was very much an Anglophile. He loved the British parliamentary model. And if you look at his writings as a young man, he wrote on the great tradition of the parliamentary orators, and he just had this romantic fascination with the British Parliament. And so the idea of separation of powers was really anathema to Wilson. And if there's one thing kind of institutionally that lurks there in the background of any kind of political argument of his, it's that animus toward separation of powers. And so this language about the living Constitution, the organic Constitution, the Darwinian Constitution, that kind of all is building to this criticism that comes just after that in the speech of the separation of powers. And so that's where it's going. To think about sort of the principles there, which you asked about, I mean, sort of the main complaint is that that we have really failed to understand government with a true historical sense. And this sort of parallels a criticism that would later be made by John Dewey of the American founders. Dewey says at one point in his essay on liberalism and social action that the founders lacked historic sense. They lacked historic sense. And what the progressives meant by that, what Wilson really means in that quotation that you read, was that there's no grudging the framers of the Constitution for the form of government that they put forward. It made perfect sense for their own historical environment. They had liberated themselves from a centralized despotism as they saw it, and it was perfectly natural for them to construct a government where the central power was checked and restrained in a variety of ways, and made it very difficult for the central power to expand beyond that. And so the argument is, look, it's perfectly appropriate, or could reasonably be said to be appropriate for those circumstances. The great sin then of the founding generation was, however, to take these notions of government, which were particular to their own time, and to think that they actually could transcend those historical circumstances, to think they were talking not just about government for themselves, but government for all men everywhere. And this is something that Lincoln points to in that great letter he writes in 1859, about Jefferson, where he talks about, Jefferson having, this is what really distinguished Jefferson, was he was talking about government not just for his own time, but for all time. And that's what really set the progressives off. And so when they talk about progress, when they talk about having a proper historical sense, when they talk about having a kind of organic notion of government, they mean, getting over the founders' kind of universalism, their notion that there are kind of transcendent notions of just government, that you see laid out in the Declaration. So much so that Wilson says at a couple of points, he says this almost directly in one speech on the occasion of the 4th of July, that if you want to understand the Declaration of Independence, don't repeat the preface. All the natural law language there at the beginning.
It is interesting to think, not to cut you off, it is interesting to think somehow the claims made by an historicist, or a historicist claims, they're never really limited by their own sort of logical postulate. I mean, that is, if you criticize someone for making a natural law claim, a transcendent claim, somehow the own logic of that does not apply against yourself. That is, Wilson himself would be
exactly
limited
right.
by that, but somehow this isn't considered, or is it he has really a faith and or hope in history and progress, such that he understands things will change, his science will become outdated, but something else will come along, because there's history is kind of a there is a telos, it's moving towards a consummation.
Well, there's a parallel here, I think, between the way folks like Wilson thought about this and the sort of philosophical argument of 19th century German historicism and the criticism you're raising, the sort of logical criticism, which is to say, if you have this notion that all thought is sort of historically conditioned, or all notions of justice are contingent upon history, then how is it that one's assertion of that very argument is not itself contingent and all of that? As you know, of course, this is the criticism, devastating criticism made by Friedrich Nietzsche of the German historicists who had preceded him, and I think especially of Nietzsche's his third untimely meditation, on the use and disadvantage of history, is just absolutely devastating on this point. Now, for the American progressives, I don't think they had thought through it nearly as seriously, of course, as the Germans had. They sort of adopted this sort of paradigm, that was kind of in the air and the water in the way that they were educated. They had this faith in the end of history, and so certainly for somebody like Wilson, and you see this in some of those 1912 campaign speeches, by the way. There is this notion of an end that all thought previous to us had kind of been contingent, but we are in the working out of the final stages of democracy, and that's very strong. And Wilson has some great commentaries on classical notions of democracy, some commentaries on the Aristotelian cycle of regimes in his textbook, The State, for example, where he says, well, they thought there was this cycle, and, you had sort of this perpetual, assertion and degeneration of regime types, but we progressives know that modern democracy is the final stage, and so they're either there or just about there. And so that gives them a kind of notion of justice which isn't historically contingent in the way that they accuse or see, sort of the earlier liberalism of the founding period.
Thinking about Wilson again, who he's obviously a central figure in the rise of American progressivism. Also, he's, my understanding, he's one of the first minted PhDs in social science in this country. He studies at Johns Hopkins. Talk about his academic background, but also when he thinks about liberalism and the claims of classical liberalism, what really, why is it finally flawed for him? Is this because of what he learns from the Hegelians, or are there other things going on? In particular, is he just appealing to hard sciences, really remaking what we think about law and constitution making, et cetera?
Well, I think, just to deal with that second question first, there's a little bit of a divide in the progressives, and there is that sort of reliance on science by certain elements of the movement, John Dewey, Herbert Crowley, people like that. But Wilson's critique of classical liberalism, I think, is for him as much theologically based as anything else, and he really feels like there is a kind of sort of the Holy Spirit is at work, and there's a lot of that in his criticism of the earlier liberalism. But to go back to your question about Wilson's kind of education, you're right to say that he's very much among the first generation of what we today in the modern world would consider a social scientist. And we know, of course, that all of the social sciences were kind of born in this era, and we also see coming out of the progressive era all of the professional academic associations that are so familiar to us today. So the American Political Science Association, the American Economic Association, the American Historical Association, so on and so forth. And Wilson, of course, was one of the first presidents of the American Political Science Association, that fine organization of which I am a card-carrying member, and I think he was maybe the sixth or seventh president of the APSA. Frank Goodnow was the first in 1903, one of very important and influential progressive in his own right. But if you take a look at the American higher education, say in the second half of the 19th century, there's just a massive change from the point of view. If you looked at 1860 and compared it to 1900, it's a massive change. And the reason is that you had the migration of Americans who wanted a higher degree to Europe, and especially to Germany, to get them. And it's how a lot of otherwise orthodox American colleges were very much transformed, because you still had a lot of Orthodox trustees in these colleges, a lot of them with religious missions, but if you wanted to be trendy, if you wanted to be elite, if you wanted to be doing what elite places were doing, you went and got yourself European PhDs, German PhDs. And so over these decades, America's colleges and universities became populated with these folks who were educated in very different principles. And that's how you really get some of these ideas that start to come in at the top of the regime and begin to make their way down, as I've said before, kind of into the air and the water. And then you have, of course, Johns Hopkins, which you mentioned. Wilson did not go to Germany. Germany came to Wilson in the form of Johns Hopkins, which was founded in 1876. It was founded for the explicit reason of bringing the German educational model to the United States. Not only was Wilson educated there, John Dewey was, Frederick Jackson Turner was, and a number of prominent and important progressives. Frank Goodnow, whom I mentioned a moment ago, actually later became president of Johns Hopkins. So it really is an example, if you want to talk about, well, how does sort of the classical liberalism of the earlier period in America begin to become undermined? it really is proof of the Aristotelian point that when you start to get bad ideas or corrupt ideas at the top, which you do in the American university, I mean that's the top of the hierarchy in terms of the ideas, it will corrupt the regime. And that's really what happens, by the turn of the 20th century.
Let me ask you mentioned earlier Wilson's identification with the British parliamentary system and his desire to functionally at least remake the exchange between our president and the Congress, move along those lines. What's in that? I mean, why is our separation of powers system, particularly between the executive branch and the deliberative branch, deficient for Wilson? I mean, does this kind of help us understand some of his more, his policies, I think, and the way he's approaching those?
Sure. I mean, he says there are two fundamental problems. There's the problem of accountability, and there's the problem of inefficiency. Okay, and these are criticisms that are made in a variety of essays that Wilson writes. But the book that most people are familiar with, they're familiar with anything of Wilson's, is his book Congressional Government, and that's a book which has several earlier forms. He's really reflecting on the problem of separation of powers. He's reflecting on his desire to have a more cabinet form of government in the United States. And it ultimately comes out in this book, which is published, I believe, in 1885, and later becomes, he gets credit for it as his doctoral dissertation. And it's actually less radical than some of the earlier essays which formed the foundation for it. He, in some of these earlier essays, earlier in the 1880s, had called for literally formal changes to the Constitution, where you would remove the prohibition on members of Congress from serving in the president's cabinet. He really wanted to make the relationship between the executive and the legislative branch much closer, much tighter, make one dependent on the other. Wanted to try to form the executive from as much of the legislature as he could. By the time you get to his book Congressional Government, he's kind of backed off of some of those more radical proposals, principally because he's been told by his friends he's never going to get published if he doesn't back off. But he still has this desire to bring about greater efficiency and greater accountability. The accountability problem, what Wilson sees is a Congress which is grossly decentralized. I mean, he's got a very nice criticism of Congress in the second half of the 19th century there in that book. He goes in, he says, look, we have elections. People aren't seeing what their members of Congress are doing. Laws are made behind closed doors in committee rooms. It's all this, sort of smoke-filled rooms, to use the common term. People aren't voting on the basis of what their members of Congress are actually doing, and members of Congress are just the worst sorts of characters. And there's a lot of disappointment in Wilson because he's saying, gosh, what are young, patriotic, educated people like me? What's our place? How can we make our mark in politics? Who wants to be one of these corrupt politicians? And so Congress is full of people like that. And what we need to do is to open things up. We need a party system like the parliamentary model has. We need people to stand on clear platforms. We need them to be accountable for their ideas. And we need government, we need the executive and the legislature to rise and fall on the basis of public opinion. And we need greater openness. And he's got, again, this romantic notion of the British parliamentary debates, and he's contrasting them to what we see in the American Congress. And, it doesn't measure up. And by the way, it doesn't quite measure up even today, if you think about it. Anyone who watches Parliamentary Question Period on C-SPAN and then watches our own legislators deliberate in our own Congress is, a little disappointed. So Wilson is seeing that, and it's much worse, of course, 100 years ago. So that's the accountability. The efficiency, obviously, this is more straightforward. Who in their right mind who wanted government to actually do something would design a system like the separation of powers? It doesn't make any sense. You have elections. People elect a majority, and then nothing happens because that majority has to contend with other branches which don't answer to it. And it's, the problem of so-called gridlock, the term we use today in American politics, goes way back, of course, and so there's great frustration with that. So part of the solution is to overcome the separation of powers. And part of it is, by the way, then to go on to the administrative side, to give a lot of power over into the administrative area and to liberate administrators from the strictures of separation of powers. And that's the other side of that argument.
In thinking about the administrative state, but also his aversion, and I think really he looks inside Congress and he sees something like competition amongst different interests, and just the presence of interest alone seems to bother Wilson, and the fact that less than noble interests are able to have their day, and in many ways have their way on important pieces of legislation. But of course, I mean, and I think this really gets to kind of the progressivism or the idea of progress in government, because Publius, this means the system is actually working. In a sense, if you are having a variety of interest involved, even if they're less than positive or less than appealing, this is all kind of a part of politics, and this is also kind of a part of markets as well. But
and it always will be.
Yeah,
that's the fundamental. Just on that point for a second, that's the fundamental disagreement. If you really want to get to the heart of it, it's Madison against Wilson. And Madison's argument, you think of the argument in Federalist 10, in Federalist 9, Federalist 9 isn't his, but think of the argument in Federalist 10, Federalist 9, Federalist 6. This self-interestedness is at the heart of human nature, and it's permanently at the heart of human nature. And so if we're going to construct government soberly, we're going to have to do it on the basis of that understanding. We're going to understand that there are going to be these interests, that they're going to conflict, and we build government around that sober understanding. And that's why government's limited. Government has all of those mechanical things that Wilson disparages in that quote you read when we started the podcast, right? For Wilson and for the progressives, it's really at the heart of progressivism is this argument that that's not a correct account of human nature, that human nature has gotten over that history has gotten human nature over that factiousness. And so government a couple hundred years ago may have needed to rely on this sobriety about human self-interestedness. But now history's overcome that. The checks can come off, the brakes can come off, as it were, because we're improved. And that's the heart of the argument. And the greatest argument, I think, in favor of Madison is a simple empirical look at politics in the late 19th century and early 20th century.
Let me ask you this. Wilson says this. Is this also kind of an application of Darwinian science outside of its proper sphere into human relations and human action? So what we're learning is we need to cooperate. Through cooperation, we're actually going to rise to these new levels of consciousness, of being, as it were.
Well, I think there's with the Darwinian language, there's a lot going on there to consider. Darwin is taken and used in a lot of ways. It's kind of the buzzword, of course, in the second half of the 19th century, and so it's taken and used in a lot of ways that really don't have anything to do with Darwin.
Right.
And we have to remember that this whole idea of progress, of evolution, is really not original to Darwin. It's around a long time before Darwin. What's original to The Origin of the Species, which 1859, I think, is when that came out, if I recall correctly. What's original to The Origin of the Species is natural selection as applied to species. But this idea of progress, of evolution, is around long before that, even back into certain parts of the French Enlightenment and everything else. So we have to be careful when we see Darwin, because to some of us that means certain things. To a lot of the progressives who used it, it's a lingo that's current and is used and abused and used in a lot of different applications, and so we have to be pretty careful about that. Now, Richard, remind me of the sort of where did you want to direct on the base?
Well, no, because you have both, say, right-leaning Darwinians or right-leaning progressives or left-leaning progressives, in the sense of
Sure.
they both seem to be appealing to science as helping to explain man in a new way, and liberating him from, a classical liberal understanding of government, and this helps us to think better about, say, the market, or this helps us think better about how we should organize government. John Dewey, in particular, might be probably the best example of what I'm thinking in terms of looking at science as a way to better understand something. That's not necessarily that we wouldn't think of as being like hard science, but human nature or public policy or education policy, et cetera. Let me ask you this: with the administrative state, Wilson, obviously the glory of the administrative state will be its separation from politics, and then this will allow the disinterested civil servant, the career civil servant, to apply the knowledge and training he's accumulated to difficult questions of public policy, which have become even more complicated by modern society, and by the development of the market and the growth in population and all of these sorts of things. But isn't this? I mean, it seems to me this is something we kind of laugh at today. That these people, bureaucrats as we call them, actually have a sort of accumulated special expertise. But in thinking about that, does Wilson's model of bureaucratic statesmanship still ring true with us, or do we know too much now? Have we progressed beyond Wilson?
Yeah, what you're really asking is, where has the romanticism gone with respect to the potential and the expertise of those who are going to run the administrative state? And you're very much correct that we no longer have a kind of romantic view of agencies, of bureaucracy. The term bureaucracy itself is pejorative in the American lexicon. When we think of, and my own sort of personal opinion is this may yet be the savior of American politics, is that when we think of bureaucracy, we don't have a romantic view of it. We think of the Department of Motor Vehicles, we think of the Post Office, we think of the most inefficient, unresponsive, unhelpful kinds of organizations that we can, and it's why I think if you think of current politics, it's why I think the Obama administration has had a very hard time selling Obamacare, as it's called, because when Americans think of that, even those who might be generally sympathetic to the ultimate cause there, they think of people like the DMV and the post office running their medical care, and that's never a good thing. And so we don't have this romantic notion. The progressives did. The progressives did. They really, if you read some of the early essays of Wilson's, there is this exuberance about, where is the place for me and other young, patriotic, educated people like me to make our mark? It's not in politics. It's in administration. And a lot of the early arguments, progressive arguments for greater administrative power, for greater administrative independence, those arguments made by people like Frank Goodnow, whom I've mentioned, by people who come later, like James Landis, who was one of FDR's architects of the modern administrative state, is this exuberance and almost unbounded optimism about the objectivity of administrators, about how if you've got the administrators out of politics, if you somehow freed them from having to run for election, as crazy as this sounds, by the way, now, but if you somehow liberated them from the normal self-interested concerns, as if man could actually be transformed out of that self-interested nature. You almost hear Madison saying from the grave, right? Then government could do things that we never imagined before. And there's this romanticism about administrators throughout much of the 20th century. And it comes crashing down in a lot of places, but we see it probably most strongly in the 1970s, where all of the interest groups, which had thought that if we just give more and more power to administrative agencies, especially over things like quality of life issues that we saw coming out of the Great Society, that they would go in the right direction. And there is the rise of what we come to call capture theory. And what folks realize is, wait a minute, you take these individuals and you put them into administrative agencies, and guess what? They still act like individuals. They still act like self-interested human beings, just like anybody else. And so they become captured by the industries that they're supposed to regulate. And that's where in this country you then get the rise of the folks, the Sierra Clubs and the National Natural Resources Defense Council, places like that, who then start to take administrators and sue them in federal court because the romanticism is gone about the objectivity of the administrative class. And they now, the agencies are looked at in a very negative light. They can't be trusted any longer. It's no longer the case that we should just give them more and more freedom to do their job. And this is kind of a sort of the progressive kind of dream and exuberance that kind of comes crashing down. And it happens in various places throughout the 20th century, but that's the most obvious place that I can think of.
It does seem, though, despite all of dismay, I think at bureaucratic departments in Washington, there's also this kind of reflexive tendency still in our politics, which sometimes is quite strong. That if there is a major disaster or something goes wrong or et cetera, or we find this company was doing this, that the automatic solution, Dodd-Frank, I think really epitomizes this, is to create another council or another department or another agency that will have certain people looking into things. And if anything, Dodd-Frank may be legislation that has really epitomized, I think, the idea of separating regulation and superintendence of market behavior away from actually the Congress, where you have entire agencies whose budgets are, from the reading of the legislation, are insulated from congressional control, which is astounding at a certain level. Let me ask you this. It seems to me also these administrative agencies are a part of the executive branch, and the progressives had a theory of executive power, certainly new also in American political thought, that somehow the president will embody the people, that he will be a national representative. It seems to me this is current. This is actually the default way we think of executive power. I mean, the criticisms of Obama are, he's not leading the people, et cetera. Talk about that, if you will. Why is the president so important for the progressives?
Well, in a way, it's finally it is for Wilson, and it really is for Teddy Roosevelt as well. It's the way that we can get around the problems of the separation of powers from the point of view of the progressives. So if you come to the realization that you're not going to change the Constitution formally, I mean, they got the 16th and 17th Amendments, but beyond that, if you're not going to be able to turn this into, as a formal matter, the British parliamentary model, well, what do you do? How do you get then the coordination among the branches so you can have efficient and strong government and active government that you want? And Wilson is looking somewhere in the system. And he, by the way, first looks to Congress. As I said, he loves Parliament. He says, well, Congress can be the focal point of the American system. Well, it turns out even Wilson figures out that it can't be. And he has an example in mind. And there's a very important book that Wilson publishes in 1908 called Constitutional Government in the United States. And it's based on lectures that Wilson gave at Columbia in 1907. And it marks a real change because Wilson looks to the president, whom he had prior to that really considered as a kind of chief clerk. And who's the example he's looking to at this time? Well, it's Teddy Roosevelt. And he sees in Roosevelt, and he thus sees in the president, the capacity for real leadership, the capacity for somebody in the system to transcend the separation of powers. And so he gives, in this essay, it's in a chapter called The President of the United States in this book, this notion of a president who doesn't get his power from the Constitution. He gets it from the people directly. He gets it on the basis of his popularity, on the basis of his being the only figure for whom the whole nation votes collectively. And the president can use that popularity to overcome some of the constitutional obstacles and to move the government as a whole in the direction that he believes the people are calling for. And you're exactly right in the premise to your question. This is the modern presidency. It is today's presidency. And if you look at the campaigns we have going on for president, what are we asking our candidates to do? We're asking them to put forth a vision. We're asking them to put forth a legislative program. We're asking them what laws they're going to make, as if that isn't absurd on its face. And this is it really comes out of the progressive model of presidential power based not on the Constitution, so where it's even, but based on popularity. And so we have the situation now where you follow the various political blogs and all of that, the talk shows, and we monitor presidential approval ratings like we monitor heart monitors on critical patients. It's up a point, it's down a point. And why is this important? Because it's a measure of the power that the president can wield, and it's on the basis of public opinion. So it's been extremely influential.
Let me ask you this, and also I'm thinking about getting around politics, getting around the separation of powers. I mean, is this also the way to think about something we haven't talked about, which are kind of the direct democracy techniques that come about in this era, the recall, the referendum? There's obviously a lot of that going on. Because there's also this idea of insulating government from politics, and yet this movement seems to invite it. Unless you're able to, I think, if you combine, say, the ability of certain leaders to lead public opinion, guide public opinion with, say, a direct democracy, a recall campaign, or an initiative campaign, now this might actually get around, say, theory of representation blocking perceived popular will. Am I right in thinking about sort of that tension there?
There is a tension, but it's one, you have to think about direct democracy measures, which you're right to point out are also a very important legacy of the progressive era in our politics today. It's not just about allowing public opinion to kind of get around institutions. It's also about facilitating a progressive leader's ability to influence public opinion. That is to say, it's as much about going from the top down as it is from the bottom up. Because when you bring in these mechanisms of direct democracy, you're bringing the progressive leader, his rhetoric, his charisma, into much more direct contact with public opinion. And there's a lot of public opinion leadership that can go on there, and that's part of what that's about. It's why people like Teddy Roosevelt, Robert La Follette, Hiram Johnson are all sort of leaders in the direct democracy movement. And I should point out, it's also an area where there's a little bit of difference between folks like Woodrow Wilson on the one hand and folks like Teddy Roosevelt on the other. Both of them are advocates, or one might say they're supporters of direct democracy mechanisms, things like the ballot initiative, the recall, the referendum, other reforms which we see, by the way, at the state and especially at the municipal level, city manager form of government, for instance, nonpartisan local elections. But for Wilson is much more cautious about this. Wilson has a much greater respect for institutions than Roosevelt does. Roosevelt has a tremendous impatience with institutions. And so Roosevelt, in a way, wants to kind of throw the whole thing out, whereas Wilson wants to reform it. And if you see some of the debates between them and some of the arguments between their different positions, you see this. So, for instance, Wilson is a defender of the party system, not because he likes the way parties were in the 19th century, but it's because he thinks they can be reformed and co-opted for a progressive purpose. Roosevelt thinks they're incorrigible, they're permanently corrupt, and they have to be gotten rid of, essentially. And so the Progressive Party is a party to end all parties. So there's a difference there. You see it on the judiciary, by the way. Roosevelt rails against the judiciary, hates the judiciary. The judiciary, during this time is overturning a lot of progressive legislation. Wilson sees instead the potential in the judiciary. He says, the judiciary may not be an agent of progress now, but it has been in the past and can be in the future. And, of course, he proves to be very correct about that. So there is a difference between them on the direct democracy question.
Also thinking of, just kind of a recent critique that I've read. When we think about the progressives and their popular appeal, I mean, you and I have really talked about intellectual foundations. It seems to me also there is something else that's happening in this country, that's happening in European countries, of just this awareness in the late 19th, early 20th century of tremendous gains in science, wealth, technology. And, I mean, is it fair to say, I mean, people are wanting governments to make their lives better? I mean, we're wanting to see if, we've got this sort of, market and business activity, which is tremendous, but, can governments actually replicate that? I mean, is this also a way to think about, at least the popular appeal progressives get, that they're, as opposed to their opponents, willing to use these gains now in the sphere of government? And then also I wanted to ask you, and thinking about the progressive direction of the 20th century. I mean, I was recently at a conference and someone said we live in a progressive world, and speaking about particularly American constitutional thought and the shape and practice in American government. And I was wondering, is that, do you think that's the best way to describe it? Are there other competing, not necessarily exclusive, but other ways to think about this kind of broad direction of growth in federal government power over the course of the 20th century?
Well, I mean, two different questions there. I think the first question about how does progressivism kind of catch on, and partly it's an empirical question. You're asking, well, gosh, what's going on the ground, and is there this call for progressivism? Partly there is, and partly there isn't during the actual progressive era itself. Wilson, is a successful politician in some ways and unsuccessful in others. Teddy Roosevelt, as popular as he was, also has certain failures. And so, in spite of the argument of the progressives themselves that, hey, this is what the people are calling for, in fact, there's a lot of empirical evidence to the contrary, and it's hard to see this overwhelming push for progressive reform. Where you really get that is, of course, in the New Deal, because you get the much greater occasion, the much greater opportunity for turning to the solutions that science offers. And so FDR himself, in laying out a response to the Depression and all of that's going on in the late 20s, he points to the progressives, and he says, this is the intellectual foundation for us. If you look to a speech he gave in 1932, campaign address on progressive government from the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco, given in September of 1932, he points back to TR and especially to Wilson, and he basically says, we now have the occasion for this. And, I think there empirically, this is as much a question for an historian as it is for a political theorist like me, but it seems empirically there's the ground is better prepared for progressive reform. In terms of the second part of your question there about is it sort of fair to call, or is it correct to call our times today kind of progressive times? Partly we call them progressive times because the advocates of the style of government we have themselves have chosen that label. They've consciously hearkened back to the original progressives, perhaps most famously with Mrs. Clinton, the 2008 Democratic primary campaign, where she said, I don't consider myself a liberal, right? And of course, you don't want to say you're a liberal because that's still a dirty word based on all the politics from the 1980s, right? I'm a progressive. But then she makes clear it's not just about a nicer sounding word. She was pressed on, and she said, well, by that I mean going back to the original progressive era, to Theodore Roosevelt, and she elaborated on that. And now you have organizations like Center for American Progress, which is certainly the most influential think tank on the left these days. And by the way, which has now a whole project devoted to protecting the legacy of the progressives against the assaults against it that some of us have made on the other side. So the left itself today has claimed this model of progress, and I think somewhat justifiably. Certainly, if you look at the notions of government that they have, it's not an accident that President Obama, for example, last month went back to Osawatomie, Kansas, which is the site of Theodore Roosevelt's famous New Nationalism speech from 1910, where he laid out a vision of government which essentially, if you take a look at something like Dodd-Frank, which you mentioned a moment ago, couldn't have made Teddy Roosevelt prouder. So there's a conscious connection, and I think it's justified. On the other hand, there are ways in which politics today is very different. If you take a look at the moral arguments made by today's left, or the arguments made on moral questions by today's left, they're very different than what someone like a Woodrow Wilson or Theodore Roosevelt would have promoted or would have adopted. So, there are some continuities and discontinuities, I think, there.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think that's interesting because part of the New Deal, at least the way I understand it, is actually an attempt to shore up the family, as it were, and actually to shore up kind of a one wage earner family, and to give it a more permanent basis through industrial policy, which certainly is nothing no political party would advocate today for a lot of reasons, most of which are good. But it seems to me today's progressives wouldn't even say that the family is the basic unit of society. I mean, they would say it's the individual, and by that they mean something, I think, kind of postmodern. I think about individual liberty, but this also, I think, gets
right. As long as the meaning of what it means to be an individual and the meaning of liberty is understood,
yes,
in a very postmodern sense, which is to say we can pour whatever meaning we wish into that. There's no foundation of that in nature, for example.
And this also kind of harkens back to, I mean, just classic. Thinking about democracy, particularly Tocqueville, as well, and I guess it looks as if there's this progressivism part, but there's also something else that's unwound, and I wonder, in thinking about this as well. I mean, it's thinking about the structure of the welfare state and the size of American government. It seems that thinking about progressivism. Where does it go from here, given both the size of the government, our fiscal resources, but also just the lack of population growth coming out of say the decline of family, or the notion that family and children are kind of an optional thing. It's a lifestyle choice, not something we're built to do, as it were. It seems to me that progressivism has a story that's leading the consolidation. Seems to be kind of producing the opposite almost, which is kind of an anarchic individualism. What do you think about that? Well,
I think by anarchic individualism, I take it you mean some sort of what Tocqueville means by the term democratic individualism, right? That we completely materialistic, and because of that become entirely sort of cocooned and isolated from our fellow man in ways that are pernicious. And certainly, Europe is the future, right? You take a look at what's going on in Europe. You mentioned population trends. You mentioned the problem of fiscal resources. That is the future of going down this road, and that's exactly what's transpiring there. And they're not quite sure what to do about it, are they?
No, it was actually. I kept thinking about the cruise ship disaster of that this captain who abandoned ship and these crew members as well. I don't know if you've heard that story.
I sure have.
And it kind of, I don't know. I just wondered, is that I don't want to extrapolate, but I kind of wonder, is that kind of what comes out of contemporary trends? I don't know. RJ,
it's tempting. It's tempting to say that. It's tempting if you think a few years back when you had this terrible situation in France where they had elderly people left in their left to die in the heat in France because everyone else was off vacationing and couldn't be troubled to come back and check on them. I mean, that's a bit of a stretch, but one is tempted in situations like this to think of Tocqueville's criticism of the democratic individual. That's for sure.
Yeah, no. RJ, it has been wonderful talking with you today. Thank you for being with us.
It's been my pleasure.
This is your host, Richard Reinsch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes, and links relevant to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@libertylawtalk.org.